federal regulation, we would definitely like there to be first a focus on criminal justice reform, a focus on access to elections, and then also we'd like to make sure that social equity is something that's taken into account. We know that this industry can't be just another industry. It needs to be a better industry. It needs to be one that serves the people who've been most hurt by bad laws. So that's lacking in here.
And today, you mentioned that you're getting so many different allies that have to get
It's the most heartwarming feeling to look out across the Americans from all walks of life.
You doing okay?
It makes me feel incredibly grateful to look out over the National Cannabis Policy Summit audience and the audience at our festival to see the different people that come out here.
Oh, right here.
We have business owners, we have people old and young, in a variety of backgrounds who all know that it's time for cannabis to be legal in the United States. My background started in human rights, and when cannabis legalization was on the horizon in Washington, D.C., I realized that this wasn't just an economic issue, it was also still a human rights issue. While we're here celebrating at the National Cannabis Policy Summit today and at the festival this weekend, there's still thousands of black and brown men and women who are locked up not just here in D.C. jail, but across the country. And that's something that we're here to change.
And we move forward on what's next. What I know, we're a lawmaker in person or you know, obviously video, but like, what's the next social platform?
This week and going forward, advocates from across the country will be gathering to push the administration and Congress for full cannabis consent. It's time to stop this incremental approach and give Americans what they want, which is a full cannabis marketplace that takes into account equity and that will stop putting people in jail. We'd love to see folks joining us here today at the National Cannabis Policy Summit and at the weekend at the National Cannabis Festival. The summit, this is year 5.
Okay, perfect. I know the festival.
It's year 6.
There we go.
Year 6 for the process.
Yeah.
Thank you. So much.
Now,
At the festival, we will have 6 education pavilions will be running concurrent conference style sessions. We have over 100 exhibitors representing brands from up and down the East Coast and across the country. Depending on what your special interests are, we have a lounge specially made for our veterans. We even have a lounge for our guests over 65, our Golden Plus lounge, and also our LGBTQIA plus lounge, which is supported by the DC Mayor's Office of LGBTQIA Affairs and Care. So there's going to be a lot going on. We have a growers pavilion where folks can learn about cultivation, and of course a concert on the main stage on both nights with Thundercat, Devin the Dude, and
yeah, so it's a little be like 2 shots. Okay. So,
The exact same thought process.
oh, no, this is something you have to get like 2 shots and so something related versus you're like, oh, you're making it, you know. So I just think we can probably just kind of very kind of also like
awesome. Thank you so much.
yeah, no, I think it's possibly just all these people.
There we go.
And you'll get like the links for that.
Morning. I'm okay. Oh, I give for YouTube. I didn't even notice they had all this over here. It just says coffee. Are they all coffee?
I think they're all the same.
Maybe this one's hot water? I don't know.
Maybe, I think the little one, maybe hot water.
Oops. I never felt that. Oh, I can't turn the camera. Can we turn it around? There we go. Come on. So we're not allowed to have food and beverages in the auditorium. I'm going to pause for a minute.
I told them to their face and they're still drinking coffee. But we'll get started in 2 minutes, and we are live streaming this on our National Cannabis Festival YouTube page if anyone's not to join in. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back in 2 minutes.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Phillips, and I'm the founder and executive producer of the National Cannabis Festival and Policy Summit. I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 National Cannabis Policy Summit here at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. I'd like to start this morning with some thank yous. First, of course, to the library for hosting us. I can say that we've been waiting a long time to get into this space, and it feels good to be here. I'd also like to thank Molly Heinzler, who is the coordinator for the summit this year. She has done an incredible job getting all of our speakers taken care of and making sure all of you have the information you need to be here today. I'd like to thank the UFCW's Cannabis Workers Union for making this morning's reception possible. We really appreciate the support, and it's heartening to see labor unions starting to come into the cannabis space to take care of our workers. And, I'd like to also share a couple of special thank yous today. This year's summit is a little bit different from others. For those of you who have joined us in the past before, we've had a tradition of bringing in journalists to moderate our panel discussions because we want to make sure that news about cannabis is getting out far and wide. This year we pivoted a little bit, and we decided that we wanted to have the advocates lead the conversation. So I'd like to give a very special thank you today to the member organizations of the 420 Unity Coalition, who are here this week in Washington, D.C., pressing the administration and Congress to deschedule cannabis once and for all. Without the work of these important organizations, and particularly Jason Ortiz,
Maritza Perez Medina, Morgan Fox, Amber Center, and Kat Packer not be here today. These are the folks on the front lines fighting for freedom and justice for all Americans. I'd also like to thank an advocate who's not here with us today, but I sure wish he was, Justin Streckel of the Bullpack. Many of you know that name, and if you've been on Capitol Hill at all in the past 5 years, you've probably run into Justin. He's done incredible work to support all of our organizations, and we look forward to hopefully seeing him at NCF this weekend. You know, when I heard that we were going to be here at the Martin Luther King Library today, I was struck by the power of having a man of faith who believed so much in justice and believed so much in the rights of all human beings, in a way hosting us today. And our next speaker is another man of faith and another man of justice, Reverend Raphael Warnock, Senator Warnock. And so as I was preparing today, I wanted to read a bit back over Dr. King's words, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about Senator Warnock. And I found a little passage that Senator Warnock said not so long ago about Dr. King that seemed especially important to share with all of you today. Reverend Warnock said, Martin Luther King Jr. said to all of us that we need leaders who are not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Leaders who can subject their own ego to the pressing issues of the cause of freedom. The United States Senate, the United States Congress could benefit from hearing that message right now, centering the people rather than the politicians. The phrase that stands out to me is centering the people and not the politicians. And that's why we're here today, to discuss the human impact of cannabis policy. And as you'll hear today, there is much work left to do, but at the same time, much progress to celebrate. This week, DC is not just home to the National Cannabis Festival and our Policy Summit. It's also the convening ground for hundreds, maybe thousands, of advocates who are here to demand an end to the unjust war on drugs. It is the spirit of these advocates that have driven this movement forward. The fight for freedom, the fight for justice, and the fight to protect the voiceless and the vulnerable. This week, and at this time in our country and in the world, I feel very grateful for the work of our cannabis policy justice fighters. I'm proud of their boldness, I'm proud of their leadership, and I'm proud of their persistence in pushing the needle forward. As we gather here today surrounded by the collective power of our convening, I find myself thinking of advocates and freedom fighters and human rights defenders in other parts of the world who are struggling right now. Those who are risking their lives to defend the vulnerable without adequate support. Those who have lost their lives defending what is right. And those who have no safe harbor to which they can escape. I'd like you to join me in a moment of silence to hold space for these freedom fighters, for the human rights defenders, and for the lives that have been lost. It is my sincere wish that all people can live in a world like the one Dr. King described and Reverend Warnock spoke of. A world with leaders in love with humanity who are willing to subject their own ego to the pressing causes of freedom. And today I feel hopeful that that day will come. I feel hopeful because of the advocates in this room. Before I close, I'd like to mention that we have a few more activities taking place here at the library today. Students for Sensible Drug Policy and Freedom Grow are hosting an expungement resources fair. You can get information in the foyer, and they'll take you to where the fair is taking place in this building. The Last Prisoner Project will be hosting a lobbying training at 4 p.m. The Cannabis Regulators of Color are hosting our reception directly after the summit today at 6 p.m. And we also invite you to come back to this room around 6:30 for the Equity Trade Network's documentary, Not Your Token. So there's a lot happening here at the library today. We're so glad to have all of you here. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our opening video, which is from Senator Raphael Warnock.
Hello and welcome to the National Cannabis Policy Summit. Every year, this diverse group of activists and leaders from business, healthcare, and civil rights organizations comes together to discuss the most pressing cannabis policy challenges and opportunities. The work many of you have done to break down stigmas and address barbaric criminal penalties while building a diverse culture within the cannabis community cannot be overstated. Addressing the consequences of those who have been impacted by cannabis criminalization is extremely important to my work as a United States Senator, and it is why I have led efforts to truly understand the economic and the human cost of the war on drugs. While there is still a lot more work to be done, we should be proud of the progress made and renew our efforts in this fight. I hope this optimism and commitment to restorative justice, to equity, is evident throughout your discussions today, and I look forward to seeing your continued success. Keep the faith and keep looking up.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Kat Murphy. I'm Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the largest nationwide network of young people working to end the war on drugs. And this year, we're centering cannabis justice because we have unique opportunities to really make change. We're right in the middle of our 420 Week of Unity. So thank you so much to the National Cannabis Festival and all of the organizations, left, right, and industry that have joined together with us to create the largest bipartisan cannabis justice coalition in history to come to DC to demand 3 specific things this year: descheduling marijuana, releasing all cannabis prisoners, and clearing cannabis-related charges from our records. This is our moment. 9 in 10 Americans, left, right, center, agree marijuana should be legalized. Tomorrow we've got a lobby day, we've got a vigil. We're putting together a number of different panels throughout the National Cannabis Festival and overdose awareness training. And today, right here on the 4th floor of the library, please come down. We have an expungement resource fair. We're trying to break the paper shackles of cannabis convictions. You may not know you have a charge, and you may have something on your record that is holding you back. So please come down, check it out. We're gonna have an expungement resource fair all day at the festival on Friday and Saturday, because there's a lot of policy change to happen, and we're gonna talk about this on the stage now today, but we also need to do the hard work of fixing the wrongs of prohibition. So come down, let's clear those records, and yeah, let's make some change. Because the vast majority of Americans now support marijuana legalization. And if anything, they think that we're already there. The polling is there. This isn't where we were a couple of years ago, but we've got two very capable people on stage today who are polling experts. They're going to be able to talk to us a little bit about where we're at, how we talk to different demographics, and what we need to do to make sure that this is the year we end federal marijuana prohibition.
Yeah! Yeah!
So with that, to my left, your right, I have Daniel Gotov. He's a partner at Lake Research Partners, and he heads the firm's New York office and brings over 2 decades of experience in political research and consulting. Daniel. And to my right, your left, I have Courtney Couillard. She is a research manager at HIT Strategies, and she spearheads the firm's electoral and climate research. In her polling career, she's worked multiple political races across the country, from the county executive level to the U.S. presidency. Thank you, Courtney. So let's talk a little bit about where Americans are, because I think this is monumental. In the last few years, really, in the last 10 years, 20 years at most, really 10 years, we've gone from, yes, people want marijuana legalization, but we're still trying to convince them of why it's important. So now 90% of the country says that they want marijuana legalization in some way. How did this happen?
Yeah, so it's really impressive how much public opinion has changed so quickly over the last 30, 40 years in America when it comes to marijuana legalization. Gallup, which is a national recognized polling organization, first started asking about whether or not marijuana should be legal back in 1960s or 1970s. It was just 12% of Americans who said that they thought that weed should be legal. Today, as you mentioned, it's a near, monumental majority of Americans who say that weed should be legal. And so a lot has happened, I think, through legalization at the state level, with actual, Americans seeing weed become more legal in their communities, in their states. They're seeing what legal cannabis looks like, how safe it is, and the importance of it too, for people's lives. That's done a lot to change opinion. But we also see a lot of differences among different blocks of the electorate, and importantly, I point to race and age. And so I think, probably unsurprisingly, young Americans are most favorable towards legalization of cannabis, both for medical and recreational use. We see 71% in recent polling, 18 to 29-year-olds, saying that they would favor both, medical and recreational use nationwide. But when we look at older generations, that support dips closer to the 40s. So there's some clear generational divides, but I think that something important to take away here is that over time, Gen Z, millennials will continue making up larger swaths of the American public, of the electorate, and will have a really big voice to say on this issue.
So I think that that's a really important point, right? Because the young people are really disengaged from politics right now. We know that that's the case. And so cannabis could actually be the issue that gets young people to the polls, right? Both major parties really need those young people, and people on the left and the right agree on this. This is the issue. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Kat. And the other thing I would add, I think, is just in terms of the context, is, prohibition on either cannabis or drugs in general is not something that goes back to the beginning of this country. This is something that happened in the last 50 years. And people, I think, have just witnessed the devastation that it's created. And that's been a big part of the culture change, in addition to all the points already made. So young voters obviously have been very core to the Democratic coalition. But as you noted, there's, to the extent Republicans are more divided on issues of legalization or more supportive of legalization for medical purposes, and also recreational, there are real divides within the GOP bloc, younger voters in particular. So, yeah, and I would say, disengage, and even more so than disengage, younger voters, I think, are really disaffected. Not to quibble over words, but these are, I think, young people who in some ways are very politically engaged, very active.
Feel like voting is the way to make a change.
They've been told to vote harder for election after election, and, we have a hard time. There have been plenty of studies for some time now that show that we're not really a functioning democracy in that way. So they're looking for other ways to affect change. And one of those ways is that where we've seen increases in turnout is when legalization has been on the ballot. And in the states, you can see it has not been the case in every single one, but more often than not, an increase in youth voter turnout, when they have a chance to vote directly on these issues.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because I think part of the problem a lot of times is, we get promised that a certain candidate is going to do all of these big things, and then it doesn't necessarily happen, right? So is there a difference here with issue-based campaigns specifically around marijuana legalization or decriminalization compared to candidate politics when it comes to this? Are people responding to one more than the other?
Yeah, I think what is challenging still with the topic of marijuana legalization is that there are a lot of issues today that are preoccupying us. Inflation is a very big issue for folks, public safety and crime. And so they're weighing a lot of these different topics the same ways that campaigns weigh a lot of different topics. So I think that actually with the issue campaigns, they can do a very important job of centering that issue and making that their number one communication to help amplify policy that candidates might have and might not have the time to amplify every single stop on their race.
And let's talk about how they do that. Is there certain messaging that you find is really resonating, and does it resonate differently with, say, young voters versus older voters? Is there one right message?
Sure. I think what's great is we have a lot of opportunities in how to message effectively on this issue. One that I think spans generation, spans demographic, is the idea that it helps put money back into people's communities by legalizing cannabis. And so that you see majorities of Americans say that that is an important impact of legalization. Another is, of course, medical use. And I think that that's probably top of mind, that people, I think through mostly I think through experience, seeing people in their families, friends, community, using cannabis for medical purposes, are starting to see that this is not just a recreational drug. This is something that is, very important to people's medical lives. And so I think that has helped a lot when we center that messaging. It helps quite a bit. There's also an opportunity in talking about public safety and criminal justice reform. I think that Americans see that there's a clear correlation between legalization and creating a fair criminal justice system in America as well.
So let's go back to, you talked a little bit about the history of the polling numbers here, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is really interesting. When California first really started pushing this off with the dispensaries and things like that, people started seeing imagery of AIDS patients, like end-of-life AIDS patients getting arrested and pulled out in these raids and things like that. I think that's what really changed the national conversation. And then increasingly, as these laws have been passed, people were saying like, oh, you're going to see people smoking marijuana around you, and then you're going to lose support for this. But what we've actually seen is the more we legalize, the more support there is for legalization, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Colorado obviously was a watershed. For all of these things, it's the fear mongering and some of the campaign against. And as you said, it's, people are experiencing it. They're either visiting it, they've been in these states. At this point, as you said,
It's not this terrifying, horrible thing.
It's not terrifying.
And it's also not these like stoner jokes that you see in
Right.
the 90s movies.
Right,
No, I mean,
exactly.
people's grandmas are using cannabis today.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, we did work in the Colorado campaign. And I think so the landscape has shifted a lot, but it was important then for some groups of voters who were more on the fence about it. Besides, as you said, the tax revenue and what that tax revenue can go towards, education in particular, or worried about the consequences, so that was important to assuage them. The messengers also, so having, not only law enforcement, but centering law enforcement voices, because they do tend to be deferred to a lot on these sorts of matters, can also reassure others. And then we've been looking at messaging around rescheduling, reclassifying, and what's been really strong there is emphasizing that, the states are going to have different policies, but there ought to be national guardrails, so we should not be able to be arrested and walking from one state to the next because of different laws for years.
So let's talk a little bit about this messaging. Is there certain messaging that advocates should avoid that falls flat? Is there certain messaging that maybe gets certain communities excited but turns off other communities? What are sort of some of the pitfalls that we should be looking at when it comes to messaging around this?
I mean, I think one of the biggest pitfalls is giving, platform to the opposition's false claims. Very rudimentary, it's very outdated claims about marijuana use, and so really,
it's going to make holes in your brain or whatever.
exactly, I think it's really important to stay focused on the messaging for legalization rather than having to constantly reply to the opposition, because we already have, as you mentioned, a very strong majority support for legalization in this country. And as Daniel said, I think a lot of people just need to better understand what does legalization look like for my community in reality? What are those benefits beyond just use? Whether that's revenue, whether that's creating safer communities. So I think really emphasizing and staying focused on the benefits is important for messaging.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the other potential pitfall, although I don't see that's a great one, but especially with regard to reclassifying or rescheduling, is just two things. One, not everybody, even people who are aware of the schedule, are not very clear on how it works, and it's easy to get people confused and picked up on that. It's that we're just not doing the half step, right? And then, so kind of related to that, although as soon as you tell people.
Can I pause you on that one, because this is a big one, right? Because it's not that rescheduling to Schedule 3 doesn't have some benefits, it doesn't have that many benefits, and it's certainly not legalization. So what we're pushing for is full descheduling. What are you seeing in the polling for descheduling?
Well, we have looked at legalization for rescheduling. We haven't looked at full descheduling, that would be legalization. And that's the numbers that you said, which are really high, in some ways even higher sometimes than you see. I haven't seen a lot of public polling, but we've done some internal work on rescheduling, and there's minimal opposition. I mean, it's like almost 60% support, less than 20% opposed, and more than a third of any subgroup of data who oppose rescheduling. But it starts to get more people, who we're talking about. So there's some people who are hang back until they learn more. Nobody thinks that cannabis should be treated the same as heroin or fentanyl or any other drugs. It's more serious. So there are ways to kind of shortcut the conversation, but it's solid majority support. As Courtney said, there's really cuts across the demographic and regional lines.
And it cuts across party lines too.
A lot,
right?
lines, yeah.
This is something that it's at the center of our 420 week community. It's that it's not a left issue, it's not a right issue, it's a freedom issue. And folks on both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, are advancing legislation. They're interested in this issue. Their supporters want it, right? Is there a difference in the messages or the types of things that they're looking at or that motivates them? Is there a way is there stuff that you're seeing in the polling about how we should be talking to these two audiences differently? Or they kind of all want the same thing?
I think when we're thinking about messaging towards conservative Americans who are the least likely to support legalization, though still I think encouraging numbers of them to use support, I think leaning into the economic revenue is a very easy way to meet them where they're already very focused. And I think also in talking about safety too, making it very clear that legalization is actually helping regulate safe use. It helps get over some of that. That's the main talking point for the opposition. That is just going to lead to widespread drug use in unsafer communities.
Right, it's gonna bring cartels out, and of course, we know it's the opposite.
Exactly. I think so. So pointing that I think would be effective.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. I think there's also a synergy across not just this issue, but abortion rights and voting rights. Not all of those issues are going to animate the more, not necessarily conservatives, but kind of the more libertarian folks on the right, who I think are, very sanguine about legalization. But there's a way, I think, to bracket some of these issues and talk about the attack on freedoms and how we can remedy that.
So I wanna have time for people in the audience to ask questions. But first, I'm gonna put you on the spot because you brought up something that I'm personally very interested in. So, in Ohio, we had Ohio Measure 2, and at the same time we had Measure 1, right? And so what was interesting to me is to see this patchwork. So these are the marijuana legalization and also abortion measures that went to the ballot. And so it was really interesting to see the demographic breakdowns of who was voting for what, right? Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and we did some work on the abortion end of that, but there was, maybe you saw in terms of the turnout, a real synergy in terms of younger voters, women, who were coming out and voting yes on both, or supportive of both. One of the main spokespeople or messengers for the abortion rights measure were doctors also. And I think that, I don't know for a fact, because again, they're more focused on one than the other. I'm really happy to see the outcome of both, but I think having, medical professionals and others speak to this reassures me.
And that ties back to what you were saying, Courtney, with, people really focusing on that medical side of things, the safety.
Yeah, I will say that in a lot of the research that we do, we find that people trust two types of people often. It's the professionals, so doctors, they trust their word really. They also trust their community too. And so hearing people that look like them, who come from their community, talk about this issue, why it's important, I think is also a really great way for them to kind of better trust and understand legalization too.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot of questions for our panelists, and I can keep doing this, but I want to give some space for folks in the audience. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask here today? I see one right there. Yes. I think they are going to bring you a stick mic so that the folks watching back home can hear you as well. And please keep it to a question, not a speech.
Thank you. We were having a conversation this morning about this, and obviously descheduling is like the ultimate goal. And I kind of pushed back and said, well, can our government really make that big leap? Is it, do they have to maybe take the baby steps into rescheduling? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on can we move them straight to descheduling? Do we see a need to go through this process?
So I want to give both my panelists a minute to speak on this, but I have some thoughts, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here. So we just had a press conference this morning where we had sitting members of Congress calling in front of the cameras for descheduling. So I think there is some political momentum there, right? I think also, if we move to reschedule to Schedule 3, it's not a step in towards descheduling. Lock in a whole system. That's the new system we're going to have to push back against. I think we're going to be looking at least 10 years down the line before we're ever going to be able to bring this up again. So I'm not going to say rescheduling doesn't have benefits. There are benefits, but it's not enough. Rescheduling is not legalization. We want descheduling.
Yeah. I think it really depends on whom you talk to, and I think certainly a lot of people in the White House right now believe that the incremental approach is what they are locked into. I don't know that that's universal opinion at all. Certainly, but that seems like where we're going without sufficient pressure. That's what obviously.
We're here to pressure. We're here to pressure. We're gonna hit every single office in the House and the Senate tomorrow. So we're
Woo-hoo!
I got some support, I guess. Any other questions from the audience here?
I go to the mayor's office.
Hold on to the stick mic because we want the folks listening to be able to hear you.
I'm a veteran, and I go to the mayor's office of Veterans Affairs, and I was wondering if you guys would be kind of working with the mayor's office to create a mayor's office of cannabis culture. How does that sound? Yeah. Okay, we'll be in touch.
Okay, wonderful. I see another question right back there. Am I sure? It's you. You're looking around. I can't read what it says from here.
It says Cannabis Connoisseur. What's up, everybody? I'm Kai from the Georgia Project. We work on a civic level around mobilizing voters around topics such as cannabis reform. Coming on the south side that's much behind Washington and other more progressive states, what are some optimistic point of views you all can tell me that I can bring back to my constituents around how we can motivate folks, not even just to vote, but to get other ways of civic engagement on the term of cannabis reform? Because we're not even legal. We have about 20 cities at 500 plus that are just now getting decriminalized. What are some wins that we can motivate folks to get into that November election that we can try to promote before the election?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, no, I think that Ohio is actually a great example of a state that is by no means red or blue, it is purple. That could have gone either way. We saw a really great turnout in favor of legalizing cannabis, and I think that that's a great way to apply to other states like Georgia that are those purple states. I think also just building on the community efforts that have been built out through the Georgia Project and other organizations in Georgia. What you all are doing extremely well is building a community network and talking to each other, using real voters, real people as the messenger too. And lastly, the thing that I would say is important is talking with people about the progress that actually has been made. I think voters, Americans get frustrated because a lot of promises get made during campaigns. I think it's very important for us to talk about President Biden's work to pardon nonviolent federal cannabis convictions. That's a great way to really talk about work that's actually been done at the federal level, rather than just talking about wanting to legalize or help those who have been unfairly convicted too.
Yeah, so this is something that we're very excited to see for the first time a White House actually doing this. On the other hand, we want to talk about campaign promises. We're still not there. Biden went into office saying that we were going to decriminalize marijuana, let everyone out of prison, zero out their records. We're not there. This is a step in the right direction. How do we make sure that the American that we don't lose the momentum on this issue, that they know that marijuana is not legal yet, there's still more to do?
I mean, I think it's in talking about that progress and not letting that fall to the wayside or just being a part of the State of the Union speech, continuing to talk about it and making it very clear to voters, because I think what Daniel and I see often in polling these days is that voters don't really think that anything has changed since 2020 and that their lives have not been made better. And so we really need to do a better job.
This is an issue on which it really has gotten better.
Exactly, and this is where we need to do a better job in making it clear to Americans the progress that has been made, using that proof of progress as a means to electing leaders like President Biden to continue the work. That this is hard work that we need to continue doing, and with the alternative, we could backslide on a lot of that progress too.
Wow, that's really inspirational, and I'm really glad we're running out of time here, but I want to ask both of you, yes, I was going to say, can you leave our folks with your final thoughts on this?
Sure, so, and just kind of related to what we're talking about now, I think it needs to be, both carrot and stick, and at this point, a lot more stick, frankly, because of promises that are not being fulfilled, and a lot of the things that have been done are not impacting nearly as many people as they should be, so.
Not one single person got out from prison as a result of those pardons.
So, you know, being a single issue voter, I feel like if you're, you know, tuned into cable news is like a slander. That's bullshit. Every person who is funding these campaigns, every corporation that's funding these campaigns are single issue voters. It's their taxes, it's their interest, whatever it is. And if they don't get what they want, they take the ball and go home. And we need to be more like that. And, you know, if you're not going to follow through, you're not going to get our vote. The public is ready for this. They're ready for more. There's a ACLU poll in 2021 that showed nearly 2/3, 65% of Americans want to end the war on drugs. We can be doing more.
Yeah, we got a lot more to do. Final thoughts?
Yeah, my final thought is I think that this is an issue that we should never shy away from, especially when we are considering how do we reach those who feel most far from Democrats, and that's young people, and it's also Black Americans. And so it's really important, I think, for Democratic leaders, government leaders overall, to actually respond to and represent those who elect them and put them into office. And I think, as Daniel said, unfortunately, if you do not represent, if you do not respond to the priorities of those electorates, they will turn out to vote and make decisions that might not put you into office. So it's very important for us to be listening and actually taking action on those issues that are most important to these groups that are now such important spots in the emerging electorate.
Thank you so much. Y'all heard it from Daniel, you heard it from Courtney. We've got a lot of work to do, but we have that support. It's up to us to make sure that the American electorate understands marijuana is not legal. It's not getting legalized unless we push for it. I invite all of you tomorrow night, 7 p.m. in front of the White House. We're gonna have a vigil. We're gonna make sure that President Biden remembers his promise and carries through on it. Tomorrow, we're gonna hit every single office in Congress, and we're gonna tell them, deschedule cannabis, release all cannabis prisoners, clear cannabis charges from the record. So come on, come join us. If you're here today, please come down to the 4th floor conference center. We've got an expungement resource fair. Come check out your records, see what's on there. Start the process of getting any charges cleared. You may have stuff on there you don't know about. Come find the booth at NCF. We'll be doing that there on Friday and Saturday. And you know, we are this movement, y'all. Let's get out there and make some change.
They're running a lot of behind. They're running a lot of behind. They're counting on the breakfast social this morning for carrying them.
comes here Wednesday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. But they take me out Saturday and I come to city early and my daughter and if it's a bus all story time. And when I saw her, they were texting, I said, well, that's a day for so you got any problem.
So not you.
Isn't it funny how she was posted that? I couldn't see it because I don't have LinkedIn on my I think you can still limit it, look at it. Because I don't have LinkedIn on my work. That's all I can see. So it's just her profile? It's just her profile. Oh, okay. But I know she doesn't use it anymore, so she just like
All right, well, barring someone telling me not to, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Gerston. I'm the Executive Director of the Last Prisoner Project. I am honored to be here with these incredible panelists today, and I will let them introduce themselves in a minute, but we're here today to talk about retroactive relief in the context of cannabis reform. What does that mean? Well, as we have seen monumental progress across states in the legalization of cannabis and structuring regulated markets around cannabis, we also have an opportunity to prospectively eliminate criminal penalties for cannabis, cease arresting and incarcerating individuals for this activity that we are now legalizing and regulating. But that's not the end of the work. We need to also ensure that we're doing what is needed to get people out of prison who had previously gotten sentences prior to these changes in laws, and also ensuring that their records are clear. And this is such an important topic. I'm so glad that the Policy Summit is having us here to discuss it, because I want to remind folks that even if we see the full legalization of cannabis, even if at the federal and all the state levels, we see that removal of criminal penalties for cannabis moving forward, that doesn't automatically lead to that kind of retroactive relief. So this is a topic that I hope we can keep front of mind in this movement. And I've really been heartened, being in DC this week with all these cannabis advocates, other organizations, that this is really an issue that I have found such broad bipartisan support for. And I think that's because there's a fundamental injustice in that we would change these laws but not do the work to provide that relief for those that have suffered in the past. So I'm really excited today to talk about exactly how we can achieve that. And we've got an amazing group of panelists, so I will let them introduce themselves, and I will start with my colleague, Dante West.
Thank you so much. My name is Dante West. I was incarcerated for 3 years, 8 months in the state of Kansas. Got sentenced to nearly 8 years in prison, and now I work with the Last Prisoner Project to look for other people that are incarcerated on the state level. Super excited just to be with this organization, and it's just an incredible opportunity just to find these different stories of people, and they get out and they tell their stories and they inspire these legislators to make change. Super thankful and excited to talk about what we're talking about today, and I'll pass it over to our good friend at NACDL, Liz.
Hi, good morning. Hi, my name is Liz Buttons, and I'm an attorney with the National Lawyers. I'm the head of the Cannabis Justice Initiative, and we file compassionate release motions and clemency petitions on behalf of people who are sentenced to marijuana crimes. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I'm so happy to be here and to join this panel. Thank you so much for having me.
Good morning. It is an honor and a pleasure to share this with you today. My name is Ronald S. I'm the Executive Vice President of an organization called Just Leadership USA. out in New York City. We are a national criminal justice reform organization committed to improving the conditions of people with lived experience. We have a leadership development program and we do policy work on the federal and the state level. I served 27 years in the Michigan Department of Correctional and Wrongful Convictions from 1985 to 2012. Released by the federal courts, and I come back to do this work. Glad to be part of this panel. Thanks for inviting me.
So Liz, I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about the Cannabis Justice Initiative and really kind of underscore what it's like if we took the approach of what we're kind of left with right now, at least at the federal level, of taking on these cases of people who are still incarcerated for cannabis individually via litigation or clemency, kind of what that looks like and the types of cases that you work on.
Thanks for having me. So as I said, I'm counsel for a project called the Cannabis Justice Initiative. And it's a partnership between the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and LPP, our wonderful partners at LPP. So we file compassionate release motions and clemency petitions. And what does that mean? So once someone is sentenced and they're incarcerated, they can go back to the federal judge that sentenced them and ask that judge for compassion and mercy to let them out. So we file these motions trying to get these judges to have some kind of compassion and let our clients out, and let our constituents out. The other thing we do is we file clemency petitions before President Biden. And we're trying to get Biden to grant clemency to our constituents. We have something like before President Biden that he could grant immediately tomorrow. So each of our clients is worthy of clemency, of course, but we would love for President Biden to grant a categorical clemency for all folks who are inside for marijuana convictions. Now, Biden has granted about 113 petitions, and Obama granted 1,800. So Biden has a lot of work to do. He has a lot of work to do both now and also hopefully after the election. And we are hoping that he will act and grant more clemency petitions. I just wanted to talk about a couple of our clients. So for example, we have clients who are inside for 24 years and even a life sentence just for marijuana. I'll give you an example. We have a constituent who is 63 years old. He's serving a 23-year sentence. He served 12 years. Because he's 63 years old, he has some health issues that have been exacerbated in prison. His daughter was diagnosed with cancer and is a cancer survivor, and he has children and grandchildren. We filed a compassionate release motion before the court. The court denied that motion. It's the Southern District of Texas. We have a clemency petition for this individual, and it is before President Biden. And so we are really hoping that President Biden will pass that, will grant that petition. We have another constituent who has a 30-year sentence, and they've served 18 years. Over and over again, you can see these persons who are incarcerated for 5, 10, 15, 24 years in prison. So that's what we do, and we can talk more about that in a minute.
And I think it's so important not just to tell the stories of these excessive sentences, because I think often there's a misconception that if you're getting a sentence for cannabis, completely victimless cannabis activity wouldn't be lengthy. But of course, because of things like habitual offender laws and mandatory minimums, all of the ways that our sentencing guidelines work to enhance sentences, that's not the case. And we have a number of individuals serving life sentences for cannabis. And to Liz's point, we don't have effective mechanisms for release just trying to do that via litigation. Achieving compassionate release, achieving clemency is exceedingly difficult. But we have 2 success stories here of individuals who are able to fight their own cases and achieve freedom, but that's very, very difficult. And that's why we really need to be working both at the state and federal level to find pieces of legislation that would enact systemic reform that would put the onus on the state to provide opportunities for release or reductions of sentences for those with cannabis offenses. But again, Dante, you are one of these success stories of someone who had the courage to fight their case. And I just think your story is so inspiring, so I won't spoil it, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you were able to achieve your freedom.
Yeah, of course. You know, back in 2017, like I mentioned before, I got sentenced to nearly 8 years in prison for a pound of marijuana in the state of Kansas and traveling from California. And ultimately, when I did, you know, kind of just coming in, never traveled outside of California before, and I won't say the story too long, but just seeing those troopers and seeing how officers kind of pick and choose on drivers, having out-of-state plates, be it people of color, of course. And meanwhile, like I said, man, I got put over having dirt on my license plate, right? Road grind from traveling. It was a crazy story, right? And pulled over, cleaned the license plates off. Ended up arriving at a friend's house, and he ended up telling on me and said he was going to buy a pound of marijuana from me. And his testimony alone convicted me. Ended up going to jury trial, right? And it's something that we talked about at the press conference that is super important. When they did end up sending me to prison, you know, I had to choose a foster family, you know, for my 8, 9-year-old brother, which were very, very young, right? But then eventually, just going and sitting down in prison and keeping them in the back of my mind really motivated me to kind of just really focus on my case, right? And I would see these lifers, to your point, Sarah, just fighting to go home, right? And they had various charges, and I felt like if I applied that same energy with people like myself, I would have an opportunity to go home. I ended up losing in direct appeal, but eventually, you know, I wrote like 125 state representatives. You know, I wrote 40 senators on the state level. 4 people actually even wrote me back, right? Coincidentally, 2 Republicans, 2 senators, which is really remarkable. One actually came and see me in the middle of COVID. His name is State Rep Willie Dove out of Leavenworth. And he couldn't believe that the laws he was passing were having people serve a significant time for marijuana. And just ultimately just having that focus of just reuniting with your family. We talked about it earlier at the press conference, like how important it is, like when people do go to prison, you know, for cannabis or whatever it may be, right? But in particular cannabis, you're family, and they're taking you away from it. And that's how recidivism starts, right? When you don't have a parents in the household and different things like that. So just really being focused inside the prison, writing that motion. I think I was gonna get this clemency. She was a former Congresswoman, Karen Bass, had heard about my case, really talked to the governor, and I thought I had a great opportunity, especially with the response I got from the legislators, but ultimately, you know, filed a habeas corpus motion. A lawyer came and seen me in 2020, and I eventually got my case exonerated and dismissed, you know, in 21. So it shows that how many more people are like Dante or my good friend over here. And I think at the last Prisoner Project, we do a real point of just finding a story, finding ways we can help, you know, in partnership with NACDO, and just finding ways, whether it be passing a legislation through our policy team or finding an individual that we can help is super essential.
Thank you for that, Dante. And again, I think that just shows, you know, you can have all of the support in the world, you can have prominent individuals backing you, you can have the best lawyers that money can buy. If you're that privileged to have that, and that doesn't mean that you're going to be successful, especially in clemency. I mean, any kind of post-conviction litigation, it's so up to the whims of a judge, and they can, or an executive officer, and it's just not easy to achieve when you look at the success rates of these kinds of cases. They're exceedingly low. So for your freedom, but that's certainly not the trajectory of most of these cases. And so for lawmakers to say, well, there's already a path to relief via the judicial system, that's not effective, and that's not justice. You know, there's a reason why we call it the criminal legal system and not the criminal justice system, because is so absent from taking a case through trial, through litigation, especially in the post-conviction setting. But something you touched on was how your incarceration impacted not just yourself, but your family. And of course, that's something we hear so frequently from our constituents. And Ronald, of course, something that you can speak to. And there's not only that impact on your family and your community, but there's the lasting consequences of just once you're free, having a conviction on your record. Can you kind of talk about just the burden and, you know, the effect of who has a conviction?
Absolutely, that's a great question. I'd like to thank Dante. I mean, congratulate him on his success. Great job. Because getting released on your own and doing pro se is amazing. You talk about clearance of records, and I always call it expungement. That's very, very important because the exclusions that will be created by not clearing a person's record will cause many people to be ineligible for basic human needs and necessities, which means perpetuation of collateral consequences for these individuals, such as denying them access to housing, access to employment, access to basic services they need to be successful citizens. And this would create, to me, increase the likelihood of bad outcome, including increased recidivism for impacted individuals. Record clearance is a public safety issue, in my opinion, because records keep people from having full access to the opportunities that can make them successful in society. And if the goal is public safety, then ensuring that previously convicted people have access to housing, food, assistance, and other basic necessities is essential in making that a reality.
Absolutely. And that's why I think we can't lose sight of these two pillars of retroactive relief. A, actually releasing individuals from incarceration, but the work doesn't end there. If you're still on supervision, if you still have a conviction on your record, you're not fully free. That's not true freedom. There are so many barriers that continue to exist. And so when we do this work, it's not enough to just release people from incarceration. We have to do that follow-up work of ending supervision and removing those convictions from records. Currently, we've seen more of a trend in states to provide that kind of systemic relief, both in the forms of reduction or elimination of sentences, but also record clearance. And I think particularly that uptick in automatic record clearance for cannabis offenses. And I think that, to me, I have a lot of optimism there because we've seen cannabis reform really be the vehicle for broader criminal justice reforms. But the work is certainly not done there. There's a lot of fight left, even in states that have done this. It's often very limited. It's limited to simple possession, lower kinds of offenses. And at the federal level, we don't have this. So, Liz, could you talk a little bit about beyond litigation at the federal level? What opportunities exist? Are there any pieces of legislation that you think are giving you hope to kind of provide this systemic reform?
So we do have some good news that the Cannabis Administrative Opportunity Act, I know that there are some Senators Schumer, Wyden, and Booker are now looking for co-sponsors for this law, and it would end cannabis prohibitions by removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, and it would also provide our clients, the opportunity to get resentenced by their judge. So that's a bright spot now, and so it's in the works. You want to call your congresspeople and you want to call your senators and ask them to pass the CAOA. It's really important. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, like I said, we need President Biden to step up and grant clemency for all folks who are inside for marijuana. And that's something that we should pressure President Biden to do as well. This is, like I said, our constituents deserve this relief themselves because as individuals, but every person who is in prison deserves clemency. And everyone who's in prison for marijuana deserves clemency. So those are two sort of across the board federal actions that could be done in order to release folks who are inside for cannabis. The last thing to say is that you might have heard about President Biden granting clemency for persons who are convicted of marijuana possession, right? And so the administration is talking up the fact that they have granted relief for folks who have a federal possession offense. And let me just tell you that it didn't release anyone from prison. In fact, none of our constituents were actually affected by this law. People are not necessarily prosecuted for marijuana possession anymore, and they don't serve the long sentences. And so Biden or VP Kamala Harris brag about the thousands of people that they have released from prison. It's actually, it's not as far-reaching as we'd like. So again, this is about granting clemency to folks who, anyone who's incarcerated for cannabis crimes.
And I think highlighting the clemency power is really important because I've said this before, these aren't novel issues. It's not like there's a lot about cannabis reform and how we build an equitable industry that are complex questions. This kind of reform, we have a framework for it. We have models. Presidents in the past have used categorical clemency, and President Biden has used categorical clemency with these pardons. He could easily do the same thing for commutations. He could literally, with the stroke of a pen, provide relief to over 3,000 individuals still sitting in federal prison for cannabis. So the framework is there, and similarly at the congressional level, the framework is there. We have states that have successfully adopted these models for retroactive relief. The federal government could be the same. So there is hope in some of the bills that we have forthcoming, and we just need our elected officials to have the will and the courage to act on them. Dante, I want to turn it back to you. It's just been incredible to see after your release, you've come out and really been able to use your story to inspire others. Can you talk about the importance of advocacy in this work and education and informing the public on this issue?
Yeah, one of the things I experienced once getting released was I had met with the district attorney on my case, and he still wanted to give me a felony, right? And I just didn't understand why, because I feel like one, I didn't do the crime, but two, a felony is something that's, wild, right? Especially watching TV and watching Van Jones, right? He was explaining how a felony affected people of color. More importantly, so I met with the district attorney, and my defense lawyer was like, you should do it. That's kind of, we bridged the gap to that. But ultimately I got to spoke with him, and he asked me what I wanted, and I asked him that I wanted to get my case into a misdemeanor where I could work it off, right? And he said, why? I told him that if I went back to Stockton, California, where I'm from, and had to go get my brothers out of foster care, I would have to live in a certain neighborhood. I would have to not be able to vote, Things would be really harder, right? The kids would go to a great school, whatever the case may be. And he said he gave me a lot to think about. Eventually he said, I'll call you back next week, I'll figure it out. And then he called me 10 minutes later and dismissed my case. And he was the most conservative district attorney, in the state, right? And that's how we're going to solve, really the war on drugs. It's not really people saying, the legislators that already support us, the people that are saying no. And I noticed that, he told me, after the fact that he was like, I didn't know how much a felony affected Black America, right? And he was serious. He wasn't, I don't believe he was racist or anything, but I think the education part was so important to the public, and I think it's the stories, right? When we get a constituent out, we got a guy, in Kevin Allen serving life for 2 grams of marijuana, never committed a violent offense. But when people get out and they hear the stories, they can't believe it, right? And it's like a light, right? You get a person out, they tell their story, and then it shows, right? And it may not be me that inspires somebody, but if I can get someone out and they inspire somebody and then that person does it, it's a domino effect. Right, because if you're not in a conversation at the dinner table, when that legislator goes home or that judge goes home, the change is going to be really, really hard. right? And one thing I would say, the greatest gift you can give somebody is freedom, right? Not money, not anything else. And I think that's really important. The education of the people is really important.
Absolutely, and I've seen it, I saw it this morning, when you meet with congressional leaders, you share your story, you can see hearts and minds changing, and I've seen the power of telling these stories of unjust incarceration for cannabis really be able to move the needle with lawmakers on all sides of the aisle. And Ronald, I have an inspiration in the work that you and Just Leadership are doing with this as well. And something that I think is also gives me hope about this industry and legalizing cannabis is that if we do it correctly, we can create opportunities for individuals who have been impacted. Do you see that with this burgeoning industry that we can find ways beyond the retroactive relief that we've talked about to give opportunities to impacted individuals?
Oh, yeah, for sure. To speak to the storytelling piece you mentioned, you read my mind about hearts and minds change. Part of the work that we do at Just Leadership is leadership development training for people with lived experience. And one of the things we do is teach them how to tell their stories. And because stories is what's going to change the hearts and minds. And if you don't have heart and mind change, reform is not going to be sustainable. So storytelling is very, very important. As far as, the support system, the opportunities for people with lived experience in cannabis convictions, she mentioned the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act earlier. And the act, while it does a number of things in terms of the marketplace, the legislation directs funding to reinvest in communities that have been directly impacted by cannabis prohibition. And it helps improve the diversity and inclusion among licensed operators and regulated cannabis markets. Community inclusion is important because it allows them to be able to own farms and dispensaries and actively participate in the free economy, the burgeoning economy of the cannabis market. So the Cannabis Administration Act will help open those up to some degree. And also, my good friends, Marissa, see here in the audience, the Drug Policy Alliance and the Marijuana Justice Coalition, we're working around to amend the Mory Act and to seek to add additional layer of protection by providing cannabis-specific protection for workers. If they're successful in doing so, the industry will add industry-specific protections for cannabis workers, will improve economic health and personal safety of cannabis workers, with rapid implementation of industry-specific standards from OSHA, and will also ban child labor by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there is some work being done, there's some stuff being done in legislating, and the people around the country working on these issues, and hopefully we can have some positive results.
Yeah, and again, I think that piece really does give me so much hope because, again, we've seen cannabis reform be this vehicle for broader criminal justice reform that I hope can be a blueprint for things outside of cannabis offenses. But I see that in the potential of this industry as well. I think we're trying to build a framework for an equitable industry that includes those kinds of protections, that empowers impacted workers and owners of these businesses. And so that's hopefully something we can model with this industry that will have impact beyond just cannabis. I want to thank all of you fantastic panelists for being with us today, for talking about your work. The work that you're doing is amazing. And 2 minutes for questions, if anyone has questions. Oh no, we don't have questions. If you have questions, get our contact info. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Policy Summit for having us.
Thank you.
To marijuana legalization.
The Oregon State Legislature, where he was elected Speaker of the House to the U.S. Senate, he has fought for progress and justice on too many issues to count. We are here to talk about is cannabis, and few people in Congress have worked as hard to undo our nation's disastrous prohibition policies. Beyond supporting the legalization of cannabis for adult use in his home state, he has fought for veterans to be able to more easily access medical cannabis under the laws of their states. He's the Democratic champion for legislation to help normalize the state legal cannabis industry and improve both public safety and opportunities for small businesses by making it easier for banks to work with licensed cannabis businesses. He has steadfastly worked to include cannabis policy reform language and appropriations legislation when congressional politics and misinformation have often stood in the way of sensible standalone measures. He has stood for restorative justice for the people who have been most harmed by the criminalization of cannabis. And he was one of the first senators to strongly support removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. Everyone who cares about sensible cannabis policy reform should be grateful for the work that he has already done, and his leadership on this issue in the upper chamber. I'm confident that we will continue to see escalating progress in the months and years ahead. Please join me in welcoming Senator Jeff Berkley.
Well, greetings everybody, and thank you for the invitation to come by and talk with you all. It's in 2016 that I was with one of my constituents, Tyson Highworth, who was CEO of Oregon's Finest, and I was together with Earl Blumenauer, congressman who has really been a champion for cannabis on the House side. And Tyson proceeded to empty out his backpack onto a table, had $70,000 in it. I then accompanied him. We put the money back in his backpack and drove down to Salem from Portland. And it was a very strange journey. Why are we driving with $70,000 to the state capitol? Well, you all know why. Because everything has to be the cash economy in the cannabis world. Now, this was happening in a state that in 1973 became the first state to decriminalize cannabis. I was a junior in high school, and I was at a speech tournament where you do impromptu speaking, and they hand you an envelope, and the question in the envelope, you immediately give a speech, you read it out like a speech, was, will Oregon become a pot smoker's mecca? And the question, of course, was there because we had just decriminalized cannabis smoking. The problem was I wasn't sure what the reference mecca meant. And so probably not a real terrific first ever showing at an impromptu speech tournament. But it was the start of my education about Oregon laws and about Oregon's leadership. Oregon became one of the first 4 states to legalize medical cannabis, one of the first 4 states to legalize recreational cannabis. And yet it's still a crime, a federal crime for banks to provide financial services to cannabis businesses, which means no bank accounts, no credit cards, no electronic fund transfers, no business loans, and no home mortgages for employees. Well, Mr. Hayworth couldn't write a check or make a bank transfer because the federal government fears it would encourage, quote, criminal activity. When exactly the opposite is true, the cash economy encourages criminal activity. We have the challenge in Oregon of robberies of stores, robberies of employees, and robberies of customers. Bad actors know that someone coming into a cannabis store might have cash in their pocket, and they have to have it to make a purchase. Or an employee leaving might have their payroll in their pocket because they're being paid in cash. And they know that the store might have a big supply of cash because of these cash economy transactions. And just this last week, we had another cannabis store robbed. Check it out, in 2023, 123 robberies of retail cannabis operations in Oregon. 123, one every 3 days. You know that there are teams out there that are targeting these stores and making it dangerous. And we did have one employee, not last year, but previous year, who was murdered leaving the cannabis store in Oregon. So, an encouragement for violent crime, an encouragement for money laundering, an encouragement for organized crime. Organized crime loves a world in which you don't have electronic transactions. So let's fix it. back in 2015, I was serving on the Appropriations Committee, and I put forward an amendment, and this is the first ever cannabis legislation in the history of the U.S. Senate, an amendment that said no federal funds can be used to enforce this law, thereby creating it. Yeah, thank you. And my staff was like, no, this is too dangerous a territory. It's a third rail. I'm like, no, this is absurd. And not only did I put forward that provision in the Appropriations Committee, the Spending Committee in the Senate, but we passed it with the full committee. And we passed it again the next year. And suddenly people looked around and said, oh, this isn't dangerous political territory. And so we started to build momentum with the rest of the Senate. And I introduced a broader bill. Now we're 10 years into it, trying what has now evolved into a safe banking bill and now the safer banking bill. And yet we still haven't passed this bill. As the number of states that have had a medicinal or recreational cannabis economy have grown, so have the opportunity to have more senators on board. Because a lot of senators, they say states' rights, and meaning each state should be able to do what they want, but then they're like, yeah, but in my home state, we haven't passed cannabis laws yet, so I'm not quite there. So, in fact, that has been helpful. So, this Cannabis Safer Act, I will enable us to do all the things that we would expect in a normal economy. And second, it will start to address some of the damage done through unequal enforcement of cannabis laws in the past. You know, a white youth and black and brown youth use cannabis at about the same rates, but way disproportionately, black and brown youth were arrested. Way disproportionately, they serve sentences. Way disproportionately, they have cannabis crimes on their record, affecting their current opportunities. So we want to see that change. And one of the ways we make that change is give grants to states for expungement of these past crimes. So that's in this bill. In this bill is support for the community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, that serve underserved communities, our poor communities, our inner city communities. And so that would be helpful in changing the economy in those places. Individuals who work for cannabis companies will be able to get federally backed home loans, which they're not able to do now. The legislation includes study on how to open the cannabis market to more minority-owned, veteran-owned, and women-owned, and small business owners, and that would be healthy for our economy and for the communities as well. So I mentioned that we want to proceed to really press for the expungement funds. We are not telling states they have to expunge. That's a political reach beyond which we can do. But we can say, we encourage you to do it. It's the right thing to do. And we'll give you funds to set up the state operations to make it happen. Encourage it to happen. And my home state has taken strong steps towards expungement. And a real thank you to Governor Kate Brown, no longer governor, but former Governor Kate Brown, who really worked to make this happen. Finally, this legislation ensures that federal bank regulators don't become the moral police. There was something called Operation Choke Point under President Obama, and a lot of folks became concerned that they were pressing regulators to dump customers who were in businesses that the regulators simply didn't like, even though they were legal. That is something that has helped tie the Democratic and Republican supporters together, and it's an important element of this bill as well. It has been a really tricky piece, though, because the regulators don't want to be told what to do. So really nitty-gritty, like arguments over every single word in the Safer Banking Act that affects those customers. So long past time we deschedule cannabis. Any supporters of descheduling cannabis? In 1970, President Nixon, his War on Drugs, signed the Controlled Substances Act and made cannabis a Schedule I narcotic. How bizarre is that? Heroin is a Schedule I narcotic. Fentanyl is a Schedule II narcotic. The result is a series of challenges that fentanyl poses across the country. So, The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 2023 recommended rescheduling, not D, scheduling cannabis, down to Schedule 3 to allow for medical use and research. But rescheduling might be a step in the right direction, but it is not descheduling. Descheduling would allow us to fully address the crime, the harms of criminalization, the prison sentences, the prison records, the fines, the access to public housing, access to nutrition assistance, the deportations. So 24 states now have legalized recreational cannabis, 38 allow medicinal cannabis, 88% of Americans support legalizing. When do 88% of Americans agree on anything? If 88% of Americans agree on something, then we should be able to get it done. So, in January this year, a group of us sent a letter to the Attorney General and the DEA, encouraging them, urging them, pleading with them to remove cannabis completely from the Controlled Substances Act. When I drove with my constituent to deliver that bag of cash, I saw for myself how inefficient and dangerous this system is. And so we are on the brink of changing that. We have now passed out of the Banking Committee for the first time ever the Safer Banking Act. We have the support of the Majority Leader on the Safer Banking Act. We have the support of criminal justice reformers who in the past weren't so supportive, but now are supportive as we've been able to get as many elements into this package as possible for things like descheduling and like expungement. So this is the moment. Let's not let this year pass without getting this bill through the House of Representatives, that is the Safer Banking Bill, through the House of Representatives, through the Senate, and onto the President's desk. We don't know what the next election will be. We don't know what's going on. Let's have this year. Thank you all.
And she's also the vice chair of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition and an advisor to the Bradley Center. Kat also has hands-on experience working as a regulator in legal cannabis markets. From 2017 until 2022, she served as the first executive director for the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. Under her leadership, LA licensed over 1,200 businesses, collected over $320 million in cannabis tax revenue, and became one of the first jurisdictions that attempted to redress the harms caused by cannabis prohibition through cannabis equity measures. So today, Kat's here to share her wealth of expertise and insight as we discuss some of the overlooked economic benefits, right? A lot would like to talk about the jobs that it creates and the tax revenue that legalizing cannabis produces. All of that is true. But like the harms of drug prohibition, with its dispersed and sometimes hard to quantify harms, legalization also has hard to quantify or measure benefits. So please join me in welcoming Kat Becker. So to start, Kat, I just figured I'd ask you, why don't you tell me what you see. So far, we have, I think, about 30 states that have legalized cannabis in DC. 30 states and DC have legalized cannabis for adult use, and more that have legalized medical marijuana. What are you seeing as some of the sort of overlooked benefits of cannabis policy reform?
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm really excited to be joining you all for this conversation. I know that the topic is premised on the economic case for cannabis. We were talking backstage, and I was like, I'm just going to escalate this conversation. We're going to get into all types of conversations. Like, that's what happens when you can be a mic. You kind of never know what you're going to get. But I think that part of what's been overlooked, and part of the reason why I think we've been overlooking some of these other concepts is that we are too often focused on the economic benefits, or at least how the economic benefits are framed in this commercial licensing system. I think, as a general matter, the biggest benefit that's come from legalization policies and criminalization policies is the reduction in people who are being arrested, people who are being incarcerated, et cetera, but we don't always consider those to be economic benefits. Sometimes we consider them to be cost-saving measures. But when folks are talking about, particularly states that are with adult use legalization, when talking about the benefits, you often hear them talking about revenue generated as opposed to revenue saved. And the reality is that cannabis criminalization of all drugs really adversely impacts all of these different social determinants of health, like housing, education, employment, healthcare, and these are things that come of huge cost to us as American citizens. Like, we pay our tax dollars and we're funding all of these things, but it's these very social nets that folks don't have access to if we're still criminalizing substances.
Yeah, and there's a real economic benefit to someone not having a conviction, which might then prevent them from getting a job or losing their federal student aid or something like that. So a lot of the states that have legalized cannabis in recent years are including social equity provisions in their regulation. That's something we worked on in LA. I have a two-part question for you on that. One, are we starting to see the results from those provisions and programs start to trickle into communities to any benefit, whether that's a measure of economic benefit or maybe just participation in politics or communication with their lawmakers? Are you starting to see that? And if not, why? Or is there something that state regulators, state lawmakers, or federal lawmakers could do to improve those outcomes from those programs?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see those benefits and we're starting to see that progress, but I do think that there's a disconnect sometimes that happens when we have legislatures who are talking about equity and talking about these equity initiatives, and they think that all of this is going to be solved by a policy or program. And in reality, we know that that's not going to be the case. One of my colleagues, Shakia Scott, who's with the City of Boston, she's the senior cannabis business manager. She always says equity is not a program, and so I think that if folks were expecting to see equities alone through these programs, we're obviously not going to get there. What we need is a real commitment to understand, one, who's impacted by these policies, and to have government at the local, state, and federal level who are willing to address those issues. We can see businesses and people being licensed to participate in the industry, but the reality is that most folks who have been directly impacted by cannabis criminalization aren't going to have an opportunity to participate in the industry, or they aren't interested in participating in the industry. And so I think as we're starting to reevaluate these programs and assess what has been successful, what the ongoing challenges are, part of what I've learned in my experience is that we've really got to broaden the scope of what we're considering to be the opportunities that are available for folks who've been directly impacted. If you've been directly impacted by cannabis criminalization and you've been harmed, it shouldn't be the case that the only thing that's available to you is a pathway to potential licensure. We should be connecting folks to economic opportunities across the spectrum. There should not be a closed door for these communities.
And are you seeing a difference in, so like a lot of the states, some of the social equity provisions seem to be a bit tacked on, like, look, we're doing this thing rather than a central, driving force behind their total cannabis reform approaches. Are you seeing that breakdown in states? Some states are really taking a comprehensive equity-based approach versus the states that are tacking on maybe even later, some of the earlier states that didn't have social equity in the beginning are tacking on. Are you seeing any effects that differ between these states in terms of that?
Is anyone in here from Michigan? Okay, so I can talk shit about Michigan. Okay, all right. I'm from Ohio. I went to Ohio State University, so there's this like rivalry that exists between Ohio State and Michigan. But Michigan, for example, was one of these jurisdictions that started one of these equity programs, and it really felt like, at least at the beginning, I don't necessarily know what it looks like today, but it felt very performative. And I remember sitting down with folks who were running that regulatory office and being like, stop calling this an equity program. Just like, let's stop calling it. And I even, there were even conversations that I had in the city of LA where I was just like, we might want to stop calling this an equity program. Because what we're doing right now, and it was in particular because we were creating different types of classes of licenses. For example, I'll give you another, I'll talk to you about Ohio for a second really quickly. Ohio, we talked about, it just became the 24th state to pass adult use legalization. And the initiative that passed created an equity program, but the equity program that was created in Ohio would have allowed for equity applicants to have a cultivation license that was capped at 5,000 square feet. But the existing medical marijuana dispensaries had a cultivation cap of 100,000 square feet. Does 5,000 and 100,000 sound equitable to you? This is actually an inequity program. And so I think that we have to be very clear with the language that we're using. Are we talking about equity in licensing? Are we talking about equity in ownership? Are we talking about, what exactly are we talking about here? And I think that if we start to drill down on the details and actually do some evaluation of these programs, they can and will be improved. And that'll just be kind of my last point on these efforts. There is an intentional effort all across the country to try and do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And it should be no secret that this effort is directly related to trying to erase the experiences and histories of Black and brown communities and marginalized communities. And so we have to be very committed not to the word equity, but what it means and the actual outcomes that we can achieve for our communities. It's not about the rhetoric. We need to see a full-scale commitment. I want to see the federal government, the state government, and local governments keep the same energy that they had for the war on drugs when it's time to legalize cannabis. I'm like, keep that same energy. That's what
Now it's my turn to escalate, I suppose. So I want to turn a little bit to public perception about all of this stuff. As the market is coming online in a lot of states and jurisdictions, we still see, at least in terms of rhetoric, we see people bringing up the social costs and criminal justice issues from the public safety, law and order side of things. Can you talk a little bit about how advocates, policy, researchers can address some of the, first of all, I would like to ask you, do you think that those issues are honestly what is motivating this
stalling in Congress and in some states, or backsliding in some states, like you saw in Ohio, where they're allocating funds that voters specifically said they wanted to go to equity programs, they're allocating them to law enforcement programs. Can you talk a little bit about the political landscape, the conversation among the public, right? Because we know the general public, whether left, right, or center, or unaffiliated, generally supports legalization. And I know ACLU did a recent poll, 2022 poll in Maryland, that found support increased for legalization when it was combined with some equity programs. So, speaking of the general public, but then also, right of center, right, far right lawmakers on this issue, what are you seeing in terms of rhetoric, in terms of how we can sell these programs to them in a way that makes sense to them and their voters?
Yeah, there's a real disconnect between like the rhetoric and the reality. I'll use Ohio as an example just because there's so much material there to work with. But we had a situation in Ohio where the voters passed an initiative, and the entire time, like the legislature could have acted on this for years, they chose not to. They sent out a resolution asking voters in the state of Ohio to not support legalization, and then after it passed, they said that they were going to try and overturn it. And some of the rhetoric that they were using was, well, we want to protect the kids, we want to protect youth, we want to make sure Ohio is really struggling with this term black market. I went to Ohio and I heard the term black market used so much it continuously made me cringe. I've been continuing to try and tell folks that that's not a term that we should be using anymore. We shouldn't be equating black with what folks are doing when we're using this messaging. But in Ohio, I dubbed what the governor and the GOP legislature were doing as the Puff Puff Police campaign. Because they were literally trying to utilize cannabis policy reform to create new types of crimes. Like they were trying to create new felonies. They were trying to create new misdemeanors for activities like smoking outside, or and they had one law that was like, if you're not actively consuming, you need to immediately put it up or you get arrested. It's like all of these new ways that folks were trying to criminalize policy. And so for me, this has been a lesson that while, being in California, in Los Angeles, alongside jurisdictions like San Francisco and Oakland, they were really leading the work to try and model how, not that like we would, because that requires leadership and action from everyone, but how we could do good with cannabis policy. And I thought, this is great. We can all get behind it. But the reality is that just as there are folks like us who are organizing and trying to do good and protect community with cannabis policy, there's another room somewhere in the country where folks are organized or literally trying to utilize this policy to harm our communities, to continue to harm communities, to exacerbate existing harms. And so we have to be very mindful and not just continue to receive the rhetoric, but keep our own receipts, and then be willing to call folks out when it just doesn't match.
Yeah, so one of the things we talked about backstage was, from in alcohol markets and other markets that are emerging out of the prohibition, things that what we often see are the criminalized market is more equitable, really, in terms of entry, in terms of it's just fair play, whatever between. And what we see when things start to become legalized.
Well, I think it's important to be clear. Raise your hand if he speaks for you.
Special interests who have a foot in the door, so to speak, more so than maybe just general constituents, to put, to weight the regulation in their favor. So what we're seeing in a lot of ways in a lot of states are replication of the harms. And in a way, for example, with New York, when they legalized cannabis, but they haven't yet opened any retail spaces, they immediately started going after the legacy dealers of people who had the cannabis trucks who were unlicensed, whereas previously they'd kind of been ignoring them due to public pressure because they didn't want the cops going after that market. I guess the question here on this, you can say anything you want, I'd love to hear that, but is, do you see federal action on cannabis as being a benefit in terms of equity in these markets and fair sliding in these markets and easier entry into the markets? Do you see federal action is, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think what I've learned is that, like, we can't speak in absolutes. Like, it really depends on us. Like, if we want this policy to do good, it's up to us, and if we don't, if we can imagine what that will look like. In terms of the enforcement conversation, it's complex, and you're absolutely right. The legacy market was a much more equitable market. The issue is that it wasn't enforced in a fair way, and so we can see disparities even in a market that is more set up for small people and individuals to be successful. But what I have concern about more generally is that we've got to make sure we're in this very unique moment of time. Like, there's going to be a point in time where we're not here anymore, and folks are going to look back and be like, oh, what were the folks doing back in 2024 when they were like stressing about all of these different issues? And what I'm particularly concerned about is that we know that cannabis criminalization was harmful. We know that prohibition was harmful. And some of the elements that I'm seeing with these regulatory programs and commercial markets, those harms are absolutely still there. They're being created, and we can see a situation where we're still doing prohibition and still doing criminalization. It's just got a little asterisk next to it. So it's still criminalization, it's still prohibition, but there's an exception because you have a license. We were fighting early on that we were saying that it's so important for Black and brown communities to have access to licensure, because literally licensure is the difference between engaging in legal activity and illegal activity. And if our communities don't have access to those licenses, they will necessarily be squeezed out. So when I see situations like New York, like Los Angeles, where we are continuing to see, unlicensed activity, unregulated activity, one that tells me that there's still a huge demand and opportunity for there to be growth, but I'm concerned about the rhetoric of industry participants, where they're like, don't start adult use sales until we, or don't decriminalize until we start adult use sales. These are two completely separate conversations. We can have legalization without business interests at all. And I think that the industry needs to be reminded of that, because this is, and when I meet with industry folks all the time, I'm like, you all would be doing so much better if y'all could just focus on people as opposed to profit. The industry has been focused on, there'll be a panel later, focused on safe banking primarily for the last several years, because they're interested in their bottom line. So we have people who are still in jail right now for the same thing that these people are making billions of dollars off of, and their priority is protecting their banks and financial institutions. So when we talk about this rhetoric or the disconnect, we could be pouring fuel on fire, particularly with this rescheduling conversation, because what will happen, and folks have seen it already, even when there was the initial news of the HHS recommendation, what did stocks do? They went up immediately. And it's not the small businesses who are benefiting from those blips in the stock market exchange. So when this rescheduling decision does happen, and there's this flood of money that goes into the industry, it's probably going to be going to large interests, large companies. I imagine, I'll say I predict that there will be like a large catalyst for mergers and acquisitions. And as these businesses get bigger, they're going to get more powerful, and they're going to try and figure out how they get more market share. And again, if Black and brown communities and communities don't have other ways to access cannabis, this is why you got to be fighting for home grow. This is why we got to be fighting for potional cultivation, for collectives, for cooperatives. Like, these are all really important things to make sure that we still have access to cannabis. industry, and I don't say the industry at large because I got some industry friends in here, and they're like, that's not me. I know it's not you. But I think that there are some folks who will be happy to continue to profit off of the lives of low-income and marginalized communities. And I don't know about you, but cannabis is also just way too expensive. And why should we be spending, so much of our disposable income on cannabis in the first place? But this is a personal issue that I have. Way too much disposable income on cannabis.
I think that makes a good point, is that, in the, less regulated market or the unregulated market, what's the market for cannabis, what you have were legacy dealers and producers functionally doing all the R&D for bigger corporations that are going to come in once the market is legalized. They found the price points, they found the products, the THC levels, whatever. And we're actually starting to see this continue to happen. This is continuing to happen in that market, right? We've just, a lot of you heard stories about the hemp derivatives market becoming a big thing. And the federal government kind of created this issue with certain statutes that allowed for basically a loophole that people could slip through anything that wasn't Delta-9 THC. And so now we have the states grappling with this problem. I'm not sure how big the problem it is, but a lot of state lawmakers suggest that it's a very big problem. But with the way that they're approaching the hemp derivatives, this new innovation in the market that is frankly responding to regulatory excess or regulatory inefficiency in the Delta-9 cannabis market. But regulators are starting to move on this, and they might end up creating those problems down the road that we'll be talking about in 15 years of why did we do this in 2024? Why did we ban everything other than Delta-9? So I'd love to hear you comment on who you think is responsible for the hemp derivatives problem, if you think it's a problem, and what could be done at any level of government to try. Because this is it is kind of innovation. It is the market innovating. So I just love to hear what you think about that and how that fits into this whole conversation.
Yeah, this is something that when I sit down with regulators, this is something that constantly is coming up. Industry folks are having this conversation as well. And there are different camps in this. There are folks who are expressing opinions that we should ban it all. There are folks who are saying that it should be regulated. It should be regulated similar to how cannabis is regulated. I don't think that banning these products are going to solve anything. The reality is that we are talking about the same plant. I think we've created this false dichotomy between cannabis and hemp that's a legal one, but not necessarily a science-based dichotomy. And the kind of irony in the situation that we're in right now, where we have states that are proactively regulating adult use and also increasingly trying to ban or find ways to put restrictions on these other products, is kind of what's happening at the federal level. So I know that there have been different efforts where folks have said, well, why can't the FDA regulate this like a dietary supplement, or why can't they regulate it as a different kind of food product or other types of products? And what the FDA has said thus far is that they don't have the authority to, they can't regulate it under their existing authority. So they're essentially trying to reach out to Congress to have some type of new authority and legislation that would allow them to address this. What I'm keeping my eye out for is that because these are the exact same plant, it is possible, and in my mind likely, that we will see the federal government move on establishing regulations for hemp before we see them put things in place for cannabis. And because of the same plant, I think folks should at least assume that that foundational regulatory framework that they apply for hemp will be a good sense of what the cannabis regulation should look like. And so we got to be mindful how are unlicensed hemp operators being enforced against, because if we see some concerns about disparities of practices, they're probably going to be set on fire when we're dealing with the cannabis space, because now it's an intoxicating product. We're dealing with THC, which is villainous in some of these spaces. So I do think that this hemp conversation is gonna set the stage, potentially, could set the stage potentially, for what this framework looks like. But I think that's part of the reason why it's been an indication to me, I'm like, all right, well, now I gotta get actively involved in this hemp conversation, because I do think that it's going to create a pathway. And government likes to not do new things, and so if they are able to come up with a solution for him and then copy and paste it, best believe they will.
Yeah, I think a lot of members of Congress like to say, well, we're not doing anything, we're just citing legislation that already existing statute. That's why the 0.3% delta 9 THC, which was arbitrarily set, has just been repeated and now is trickling down to the state legislation on hemp and cannabis as well. I'm going to take a little turn here and ask you, do you think the economic arguments work when it comes to those who still have, there's still people who think that the social cost when it comes to cannabis, there's still a lot of stereotypes in their mind about what legalization looks like. Do you think showing the data about the jobs and the tax revenue and all the other benefits is the thing that really moves people, especially policymakers? Or do you think that there's a different approach we could be taking? And, I'm speaking specifically about the not progressive policymakers, people who consider themselves centrist or, right of center.
Yeah, I do think, I don't necessarily think this is a good thing, that this is the thing that's the primary motivator, but I do think that by and large, policymakers, government, their ears perk up when they hear the cannabis tax revenue. Folks already have $1 million about, or a million ideas about where those dollars should be spent before the dollars even become available. And again, I think my concern is that they hear tax revenue, they don't hear or even understand what the priorities of their voters are, and so they use the money from the voters to fund their own priorities, right? And so you could literally, in Ohio, use this as an example, Ohio is literally trying to use the money that the voters said should go to equity programs to fund the lawmakers' priorities, which is law enforcement. So you had folks literally like a week after the bill passed say the #1 priority for cannabis tax revenue in Ohio should be jail construction. How crazy does that sound? But that's the type of rhetoric and things that I think are motivating folks. So I don't think that there's the saying like when someone shows you who they are, believe them. I don't think that we should expect cannabis to change who these people are and what their priorities are. And so I think if these folks are set on prioritizing things that are going to be services to communities, that's what we're going to do. And that's how we've got to get these folks out of office and actually elect people who are going to be representative of their community.
So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you kind of a personal question, because you've been in this, and you've been at the forefront, really, of setting up regulation on the legal cannabis markets for about 10 years now. And I wanted to ask you, what, in your opinion, have you seen that surprised you that's changed, whether that's the way policymakers approach things, whether that's the general public, or the way that cannabis is reported on? What are the biggest changes, good or bad, that you've seen during your career when it comes to the conversation about cannabis policy reform?
I think one of the changes that I've seen that are concerning to me, this is concerning things that immediately came to mind. I'm seeing us work against our own interests. I see, time and time again, it won't even necessarily be people that we would identify as the ops that are doing things that I think could be detrimental to our movement. I think we've got to have conversations with folks who are in our tent already to make sure that they stay there. Because even in this rescheduling, descheduling conversation, there are all of these different conversations about what the impacts are, et cetera. And I've sat down with many different